Dear listener, God is on your side. Get in a comfy position and relax here for a while. Chapter 1. The Power of Resilience in Faith. Take a deep breath. Let go of today's worries. You are here, in this moment, and God is with you. Resilience is one of the most powerful qualities a person can develop. It is the ability to stand firm in faith, even when life is difficult. It is the strength to overcome fear, doubt, and hardship with God's help. The Bible is filled with stories of resilience, men and women who faced overwhelming challenges but refused to give up. Some were afraid but found courage. Some were full of doubt but found faith. Some were broken but found healing. In this series, we will explore 5 powerful Bible stories that teach us how to endure hardship, trust God, and rise stronger. Today, in chapter 1, we will begin with the story of Job, a man who lost everything yet never lost his faith. Part 1. Job. The test of faith. Job's story is one of the most difficult yet most inspiring examples of resilience in the Bible. He was a man who had everything: wealth, health, a family, and a great reputation. He was blameless and upright, always seeking to do right in the eyes of God. But in a single moment, his life was shattered. Satan came before God and challenged Job's faith. He claimed that Job only loved God because he was blessed. He insisted that if Job lost everything, he would curse God. God allowed Job to be tested, not because he didn't love Job, but because he knew Job's faith was real. Part 2. Job's suffering. When everything falls apart, in a short time, Job's life was completely destroyed. His livestock and wealth were taken away. His children were killed in a tragic disaster. His health was stripped from him, and he was covered in painful sores. His friends came, but instead of comforting him, they accused him. They told him that he must have done something wrong to deserve this. They questioned whether God was really with him. Even his own wife told him to curse God and die. But Job refused. He did not understand why he was suffering. He did not hear a direct answer from God. Yet he held on to faith, even when it hurt. Part 3. Wrestling with doubt. Finding God in the silence. There was a time when Job cried out to God, asking why this was happening. He asked questions that many of us have asked. Why is life so unfair? Why does God allow good people to suffer? Has God forgotten me? But God was silent. It was in this silence that Job had to make a choice. Would he give up on God? Or would he continue to trust even in uncertainty? Job chose faith. He said in Job 13:15, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." He refused to believe that his suffering meant God had abandoned him. Even when we do not understand, we can still trust. Part 4. God's response. When the storm breaks. After a long period of suffering, God finally responded to Job. But instead of answering Job's questions directly, God revealed his greatness. He reminded Job that he is in control of everything: the heavens, the earth, the stars, and the sea. God was not ignoring Job's pain. He was teaching Job to trust him beyond human understanding. He was showing Job that he sees the bigger picture. This is one of the hardest lessons about resilience. Sometimes, God does not give us the answers we want, but he always gives us himself. Part 5. Job's restoration. When faith is rewarded. Because Job remained faithful, God restored everything he had lost, and more. His wealth was doubled. He was blessed with a new family. His life was filled with joy once again. But Job's greatest reward was not the blessings, it was his deeper relationship with God. He said in Job 42:5, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." His suffering had transformed his faith. He had gone from knowing about God to experiencing him personally. He had learned that faith is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting God even when you don't. This is the heart of resilience. It is not giving up when life is unfair. It is trusting that God is still working, even when we don't understand. It is believing that restoration will come, even if we can't see it yet. Closing thoughts for chapter 1. Dear listener, Job's story is a reminder that resilience is not about being strong on your own. It is about leaning on God when everything falls apart. You may not have all the answers, but God is still with you. You may not see the full picture, but God is still in control. You may be in the middle of suffering, but restoration is coming. Job's story teaches us that faith is stronger than hardship, and that is the foundation of resilience. In chapter 2, we will explore the story of Joseph, how betrayal and hardship led him to greatness. For now, breathe deeply. Let God's strength fill you. You are deeply loved. Chapter 2, Joseph. From betrayal to greatness. Let the burdens of today fade as we continue this journey. God has a purpose for your pain. In chapter 1, we explored Job's resilience, a man who lost everything yet remained faithful. Now in chapter 2, we focus on Joseph, a man who was betrayed, imprisoned, and forgotten, yet rose to greatness because of his faith in God. If you have ever felt abandoned, rejected, or overlooked, Joseph's story will inspire you. Let's begin. Part 1. Joseph's Dream. A vision of destiny. Joseph's story begins with a dream. He was the favored son of Jacob, given a beautiful coat of many colors. But more importantly, God had placed a vision in his heart. He saw dreams of greatness, visions of his brothers and even the stars bowing to him. But when Joseph shared his dream, instead of being celebrated, he was hated. His brothers became jealous. They mocked him, saying, "Do you really think you will rule over us?" Sometimes, when God gives us a vision, people won't understand. They may doubt us. They may try to stop us. They may even betray us. But God's plan is not dependent on people's approval. Joseph had no idea what was ahead, but his journey toward resilience had begun. Part 2. Betrayed and sold. When life falls apart. One day, Joseph's brothers acted on their jealousy. They threw him into a pit and left him for dead. But instead of killing him, they decided to sell him into slavery. Imagine the pain Joseph must have felt. Betrayed by family, stripped of his identity, taken to a foreign land as a slave. In an instant, his dream seemed impossible. Maybe you have felt this way. Like the people you trusted turned their backs on you. Like your dreams were stolen. Like you were forgotten. But even in the darkest moments, God was still with Joseph. Genesis 39:2 says, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master." Even when life falls apart, God's plan is still in motion. Part 3. Faithfulness in hardship. Holding on to God. Though Joseph was a slave, he chose to be faithful. He worked hard in Potiphar's house and was promoted. But just when things seemed to improve, another trial came. Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of a crime he did not commit. He was thrown into prison. Another betrayal, another unfair hardship. At this point, Joseph could have given up. He could have become bitter. He could have questioned God's plan. He could have stopped believing in the dream, but he remained faithful. Genesis 39:21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him his faithful love." No matter how dark the situation, God was still working. Part 4. Forgotten in prison. Trusting in God's timing. In prison, Joseph met two men, the cupbearer and the baker, who had troubling dreams. God gave Joseph the ability to interpret them. He told the cupbearer, "You will be restored to your position." He asked the cupbearer to remember him and help him get out of prison. But what happened? The cupbearer forgot Joseph. For 2 more years, he remained in prison. It seemed like everyone had abandoned him. His brothers betrayed him. Potiphar's wife accused him. The cupbearer forgot him. But God had not forgotten him. Sometimes our prayers seem unanswered. We feel like we are waiting in a prison of hardship. We wonder if God has forgotten us, but in reality, God is preparing us. When the time is right, everything will fall into place. Part 5, From the Pit to the Palace, when God's plan is revealed. After 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream no one could interpret. The cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. Joseph interpreted the dream, revealing a coming famine. He advised Pharaoh on how to prepare. Pharaoh was so impressed that he made Joseph second in command over Egypt. The boy who was once a slave and a prisoner became a ruler. And then, the most powerful moment of all. His brothers came to Egypt in search of food. They did not recognize Joseph, but he recognized them. Instead of seeking revenge, Joseph said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50. Joseph's resilience led him to his destiny. Betrayal did not destroy him. False accusations did not break him. Being forgotten did not define him. God's plan was always at work. Closing thoughts for chapter. Dear listener, Joseph's story teaches us that resilience is about trusting God even when life doesn't make sense. Your betrayal does not mean you are forgotten. Your suffering does not mean your story is over. Your dreams are still in God's hands. Joseph's journey was long. He spent years in hardship before he saw his breakthrough. But when the time was right, everything changed. If you are in a season of waiting, suffering, or feeling forgotten, know this: God is still working. Your story is not over. He is preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. In chapter 3, we will explore the story of Moses, how God used a man who doubted himself to lead a nation to freedom. For now, breathe deeply. Let hope rise in your heart. You are deeply loved. Chapter 3, Moses, overcoming fear to fulfill God's calling. In chapter 2, we explored the resilience of Joseph, who endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment before stepping into his destiny. Now, in chapter 3, we turn to Moses, a man who struggled with fear and self-doubt, yet became one of the greatest leaders in history. If you have ever felt unqualified, afraid, or unsure of your purpose, Moses' story will remind you, God does not call the perfect. He calls the willing. Let's begin. Part 1. The early years. A miraculous beginning. Moses' story begins in danger. He was born at a time when Pharaoh had ordered all Hebrew baby boys to be killed. His mother, desperate to save him, placed him in a basket and set him afloat in the Nile River. But God's hand was on Moses. The basket was found by Pharaoh's daughter. Instead of drowning, Moses was raised as an Egyptian prince. Instead of death, he was given a life of privilege. Even in his infancy, God was shaping his destiny. Moses was not meant to be an Egyptian prince. He was called to be a deliverer. But before he could step into his calling, he had to go through the wilderness. Part 2, Running Away, the Weight of Failure. Though raised as an Egyptian, Moses knew he was Hebrew. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. In anger, he killed the Egyptian and tried to hide the body. But when Pharaoh found out, Moses panicked. He ran into the desert, leaving behind his past, his people, and his purpose. For 40 years, he lived in exile, as a shepherd in the wilderness. Have you ever felt like you ruined your chance? Like you made a mistake so big that God can't use you anymore? Like you missed your purpose? That's how Moses felt. But God had not given up on him. Part 3. The burning bush. God calls the unqualified. One day, while tending his sheep, Moses saw something strange. The bush was on fire, but it did not burn up. As he approached, God spoke to him. "Moses, Moses, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I have heard the cries of my people. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring them out of Egypt." Moses was shocked. He was not a leader. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't ready. So he gave excuses. "Who am I to do this? What if they don't believe me? I am not a good speaker." But God had an answer for every excuse. "I will be with you. I will give you the words to speak. I will show my power through you." God does not choose the perfect. He empowers the willing. Part 4. Facing Pharaoh. Courage in the face of opposition. Even though Moses was afraid, he obeyed. He returned to Egypt and stood before Pharaoh. He delivered God's command, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh refused. Instead of setting the Israelites free, he made their labor even harder. The people blamed Moses. Can you imagine how Moses felt? He obeyed God, but things got worse. He tried to help, but he was rejected. He could have given up, but God told him to keep going. Through 10 plagues, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. But after the final plague, he let them go. Moses' obedience, despite fear, led to the greatest moment of deliverance in history. Part 5. The Red Sea. Walking through the impossible. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites came to a dead end, the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh changed his mind and sent his army to kill them. The people cried out in fear. They blamed Moses again. But Moses stood firm. He said in Exodus 14:14, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." He lifted his staff, and the sea parted. The Israelites walked through on dry ground. When Pharaoh's army followed, the waters crashed back down and destroyed them. What seemed impossible was God's way of deliverance. Sometimes God calls us to step into the unknown. Sometimes faith means walking through fear, but when God leads the way, nothing can stop us. Closing thoughts for chapter. Dear listener, Moses' story teaches us that fear does not disqualify us. God's power overcomes it. You may feel unworthy, but God calls the unqualified. You may have failed, but God never gives up on you. You may feel afraid, but faith is stepping forward even when fear is present. If Moses had let fear win, he would have missed his calling. But because he trusted God, an entire nation was set free. God is calling you to trust him, to stop running from your purpose, to step forward even when you feel afraid, to believe that he will make a way through the impossible. In chapter 4, we will explore the story of David, how a shepherd boy defeated a giant and became a king. For now, breathe deeply. Let courage rise within you. You are deeply loved. Chapter 4, David, defeating giants through faith. Let the worries of today fade. God is preparing you for victory. In chapter 3, we explored Moses' journey, how he overcame fear and self-doubt to lead God's people to freedom. Now, in chapter 4, we focus on David, a young shepherd boy who faced an impossible battle but defeated a giant through faith in God. If you've ever felt small, unimportant, or underestimated, this story will remind you. It's not about your size, it's about your faith. Part 1. A shepherd with a king's heart. David's story begins in obscurity. He was the youngest of 8 brothers. He spent his days watching sheep in the fields. He was overlooked, even by his own family. But God saw his heart. When God rejected King Saul, he sent the prophet Samuel to anoint a new king. Samuel arrived at David's house and saw David's older brothers, strong, tall, and warrior-like. He assumed one of them must be God's chosen king. But God said, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." 1 Samuel. And so David, the shepherd boy, was chosen. He was anointed as the future king. But instead of going straight to the throne, he went back to the fields. Sometimes God calls us before we see the results. The waiting season is not a waste. It's preparation. Part 2. The giant appears, facing the impossible. While David was tending sheep, a crisis arose. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines. The Philistines had a champion warrior, Goliath. Goliath was a giant, over 9 feet tall. His armor was impenetrable. His weapons were massive. His voice boomed across the battlefield. For 40 days, Goliath mocked the Israelites, challenging them to send a fighter. No one dared to face him. Even King Saul was afraid. Then, David arrived. He wasn't a soldier, he was just bringing food to his brothers. But when he heard Goliath mocking God, he was outraged. David asked, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Where others saw a giant too big to fight, David saw a giant too big to miss. Part 3. Overcoming doubt and criticism. Before David could fight Goliath, he faced 3 obstacles. His family doubted him. His brother said, "Why have you come here? You're just a shepherd." Sometimes the people closest to us don't believe in us. King Saul doubted him. Saul told David, "You are only a boy. This giant has been a warrior since his youth." Others may see our limitations, but God sees our potential. Goliath mocked him. When David stepped forward, Goliath laughed. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" The enemy always tries to intimidate us before the battle begins. But David refused to be discouraged. He didn't rely on his own strength. He relied on God's power. He declared, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." Faith is believing God's power is greater than the problem. Part 4. The battle. Victory through faith. David didn't wear Saul's armor, he fought his own way. Instead of a sword, he chose a slingshot. Instead of heavy armor, he took 5 smooth stones. He stepped onto the battlefield with nothing but faith. He swung his sling. The stone flew through the air. It struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant fell. The Philistines ran in fear. The battle was won. David's faith, not his strength, won the fight. God calls us to stop waiting for perfect conditions. Use what we already have. Step forward in faith. The battle belongs to the Lord. Part 5. From Shepherd to King. The long journey. After defeating Goliath, David's life changed forever. He became a hero in Israel. But instead of being rewarded, he was hunted by Saul for years. Even after his greatest victory, David still faced struggles. He lived as a fugitive, hiding in caves. He lost friends, felt alone, and wondered when God's promise would be fulfilled. Yet, David never gave up. He kept trusting God. He kept seeking God's heart. And when the time was right, he became king. Resilience is about trusting God even when the journey is long, believing that your struggles will prepare you for your purpose, knowing that the victory is already won in God's hands. Closing thoughts for chapter 4. Dear listener, David's story teaches us that the size of the battle doesn't matter. What matters is the size of our faith. You may feel small, but God is big. You may feel unqualified, but God equips those he calls. You may be facing a giant, but giants fall in the presence of God. David's strength wasn't in his own ability, it was in his trust in God. And because of that, he won a battle that changed history. If you are facing a challenge today, remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. Your past does not define your future. Your faith is stronger than the giants you face. In chapter 5, we will explore the story of Esther, how one woman's courage saved an entire nation. Chapter 5, Esther, courage to stand in the face of fear. Take a deep breath. You were created for a purpose. In chapter 4, we explored the story of David, how he faced impossible odds, but defeated his giant through faith. Now, in chapter 5, we focus on Esther, a woman who risked everything to save her people. If you have ever felt afraid to stand up, unsure of your purpose, or unqualified to make a difference, this story will remind you. You were placed where you are for a reason. Let's begin. Part 1. Esther's unexpected rise to the throne. Esther's story begins with an ordinary girl in an extraordinary situation. She was a Jewish orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai. She had no royal blood, no power, and no wealth. But then something unexpected happened. King Xerxes of Persia was searching for a new queen. Esther was chosen among many women and taken to the royal palace. This was not part of her plan. She didn't ask to be queen. She didn't expect to be in a position of power. But God was positioning her for something greater. Sometimes God places us in unexpected places for a reason we don't yet see. Part 2. A threat to her people. A time of crisis. While Esther was queen, a dangerous plot was unfolding. Haman, a high-ranking official, hated the Jewish people. He convinced King Xerxes to sign a law that would order their destruction. This meant every Jewish man, woman, and child would be killed. Esther, though queen, was also in danger because she was secretly Jewish. Mordecai sent her a message. You must go to the king and beg for the lives of our people. But Esther was afraid. She had no authority to approach the king. In those days, anyone who entered the king's presence uninvited could be put to death. She faced a choice. Stay silent and stay safe. Speak up and risk everything. Fear whispers, stay where you are. But faith says, step forward, even when it's hard. Part 3. The moment of decision. Stepping into purpose. Mordecai sent Esther a powerful message. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone will escape. If you remain silent, relief and deliverance will come from somewhere else, but you and your family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther 4. Mordecai reminded her, this was no accident. She had been placed in the palace for a purpose. Esther made her decision. She told Mordecai, gather all the Jews to fast and pray for me. I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is stepping forward in faith despite it. Part 4. The King's Favor. God's hand in the battle. Esther entered the throne room, uncertain of what would happen. The king saw her, and instead of punishing her, he welcomed her. He held out his golden scepter, a sign of mercy. Esther had favor. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet. At the right moment, she revealed her identity and exposed Haman's plot. The king was furious. Instead of Esther and her people being destroyed, Haman was punished. The Jewish people were saved. Esther's courage changed history. When God calls you to act, He will go before you and open the doors you need. Part 5. The power of one person's obedience. Esther's story teaches us a powerful truth. One person's obedience can save many. One act of courage can change everything. She could have chosen fear over faith, silence over speaking, comfort over calling. but she trusted God and stepped into her purpose. Maybe God is calling you to something greater. Maybe you have been placed where you are for a reason. Maybe you are being called to stand up for what is right. Even if it feels risky, God is with you. Closing thoughts for chapter 4. Dear listener, Esther's story reminds us that courage is not about being fearless. It's about trusting God more than our fears. You were created for a purpose. You were placed where you are for a reason. You can make a difference, no matter how small you feel. What if this season of your life is preparing you for something greater? What if you are standing at the edge of a moment that could change everything? What if God is calling you to step forward, even when it's hard? Courage is saying, I will trust God's plan, even when I don't see the outcome. I will stand for truth, even when it is uncomfortable. I will step forward in faith because God has placed me here for a reason. If you are facing fear today, remember Esther's words, if I perish, I perish. She was willing to risk everything because she knew God was in control. In chapter 6, we will reflect on the key lessons of resilience from all 5 stories and how to apply them to our own lives. For now, breathe deeply. Let God's courage fill your heart. Chapter 6. Lessons in Resilience. Applying these stories to your life. Let the truths you've heard so far sink deep into your heart. In chapters 1 to 5, we explored 5 powerful stories. Job, holding on to faith through suffering. Joseph, trusting God's timing after betrayal. Moses, overcoming fear to step into purpose. David, facing giants with faith. Esther, courageously standing in the face of danger. Now, in chapter 6, we bring it all together, learning how to apply these lessons of resilience to our own lives. If you have ever felt lost, discouraged, or afraid, this chapter is for you. Let's begin. Part 1. Faith is stronger than circumstances. Every story we have studied teaches one key truth. Faith is not based on our situation, it is based on God. Job lost everything, but he still said, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. Joseph was betrayed, but he later told his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Genesis 50. David faced an impossible battle, but he declared, the Lord will fight for me. This is what resilience means, choosing faith even when life is hard, holding on to God even when we don't see the outcome, believing that no matter what happens, God is still in control, no matter where you are today. Faith is your anchor. Part 2. Delays are not denials. Joseph spent years in prison before his dream came true. Moses lived 40 years in exile before becoming a leader. David waited many years to become king after defeating Goliath. What does this tell us? God's promises are not instant. Waiting does not mean you are forgotten. Delays are often preparation for something greater. If you are in a season of waiting, remember, God's timing is perfect. He is working behind the scenes. What seems like a delay may be part of your destiny. Patience is not about standing still, it's about trusting while you move forward. Part 3. Fear is a liar. Moses was afraid to speak. David was mocked and doubted. Esther risked her life to do the right thing. Fear will always try to stop us. It tells us, you're not good enough. It says, you will fail. It whispers, stay where it's safe. But fear is not from God. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Isaiah 41:10 reminds us, do not fear, for I am with you. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward, despite it. Whatever you are afraid of today, God is bigger than your fear. Part 4. Your pain has a purpose. Job's suffering brought him closer to God. Joseph's betrayal led him to save a nation. Esther's courage saved her people. What if your struggles are shaping you for something greater? Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." James 1:24 reminds us, "Consider it pure joy when you face trials, because they produce perseverance." Your pain is not pointless. It is refining you. It is making you stronger. It is preparing you for what's next. If you are walking through hardship, hold on. God is not done writing your story. Part 5. You were created for a purpose. Esther's moment of decision came when Mordecai told her, "Who knows, perhaps you were placed in this position for such a time as this." Esther, this is true for you too. You are not an accident. You are not here by mistake. Your life has purpose. Even if you don't see it yet, God has a plan for you. Your past does not define you. Your struggles will lead to something greater. Ask yourself today, what is God calling me to step into? Where is He leading me? What fears do I need to let go of? You were made for more. Closing thoughts for chapter. Dear listener, these 5 stories are not just history. They are lessons for your life. Job taught us to trust God in suffering. Joseph showed us that betrayal cannot stop God's plan. Moses proved that fear cannot hold us back. David reminded us that faith defeats giants. Esther demonstrated that courage changes everything. Now, it's your turn. Where is God calling you to be resilient? What challenges are you facing that require faith? How can you apply these lessons to your life today? Remember, your faith is stronger than your circumstances. Delays are not denials. God's timing is perfect. Fear is a liar. God has already won the battle. Your pain has a purpose. God is shaping you. You were created for such a time as this. God is writing a powerful story in your life. Trust Him. Keep going. Victory is ahead. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Bible's greatest lessons on resilience. I encourage you to pray and reflect on what you've learned. Apply these lessons to your own life. Share these stories with someone who needs encouragement. God is still working in your life. The best is yet to come. Until next time, walk in faith, live in courage, and trust that God is in control. Amen.